dictator isn't necessarily a psycho, and history isn't black and white, it's all shades of grey.
Phase that we live in, do you think there's a chance we'll get to see dictatorships again?
I would literally say that the Obama years were a dictatorship of politically correct talk, to the point where free speech have become crimes, it's psychological gaslighting. It's gone down a very, very dark path. This whole idea that right-wing dictatorships are a threat is a very left-wing way of pushing you a certain way. Do you know Stalin killed more Russians than the German army ever did? Mao Zedong killed 7 times the number of his fellow Chinese than the Japanese Imperial Army ever did. But why are Hitler and General Tojo the epitome of evil and not Stalin and Mao Zedong?
What's the story of Russia post-World War? And why is Stalin this face of evil as he's projected in mainstream media now?
Stalin's stupidity plus brutality leads to 26 million deaths in the Second World War. The people are more scared of Stalin than they are of Hitler. But for somebody as murderous as Hitler, a weakling like the Tsar would have collapsed like that. The reason Russia won was precisely because it had somebody brutal like Stalin. So you tell me on balance, did Stalin destroy Russia or did he make Russia?
History has been one of our favorite subgenres on this podcast. So if you're someone who enjoys history, even if you're someone who doesn't enjoy history, but you enjoy the brutal, most psychological aspects of our times and our recent past, this is a very educative and stimulating episode because it features the one and only Abhijit Iyer-Mitra, who is known as a geopolitical analyst, but he's easily one of the best history-oriented guests that we've had on the show. I think every history buff is going to enjoy this episode, but if you're someone who enjoys human psychology, this is also an episode that you will enjoy. The intention is to take history into the deep realms of pop culture with Abhijit Iyer-Mitra. Man, I wait throughout the year to get to these world history podcasts. Very happy to be doing it with you because we've only spoken about geopolitics until this point. I think that in order to even think well about geopolitics, you need a base of history. So the world is going to get to see that side of you, Abhijit Iyer-Mitra. Thank you for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me back on, Ranveer. Always a pleasure.
Let me start by saying something I say a lot on these history podcasts, which is that history is not taught in the manner that it should be taught, not just in India, but all over the world. I think there's a lot to learn from the evils and brutalities that we've seen, even over the last 100 years, which is why today's topic is all about dictators. But let me begin with a hyper pragmatic question. How does knowing about dictators affect the modern 22-year-old? Because that's the issue that I see a lot of people have with history. I think you only really value it when you near the age of 30 and you realize how much of your viewpoint of the world is affected by the stories of the past.
So very simply, do you like slasher flicks?
Yes.
Okay. It's exactly like a slasher flick. You need to watch a slasher flick, lots of slasher flicks, in order to know when the psycho is coming for you, not to leave your door open. And when the psycho is in the house, you don't run up the stairs and box yourself in a room. You actually run out of the house. You learn from all the mistakes in a slasher movie so that you don't repeat it in real life if a psycho comes after you. And that is why, whack job dictators are very important to learn from so that you don't go down that path again. You will make all new mistakes, right? But at least it's a good way of not repeating old mistakes.
You mean for a country and a government?
For a country, for a government, for a people as a whole. Because, people collectively can tend to make mistakes as well.
Hmm.
You don't recognize the warning signs, or sometimes you misread the warning signs. You think somebody's a psycho when they're probably not.
Hmm.
And once you're stuck in a situation, you don't know what to do. And that is why, it's um, because our generation is so fixated on horror movies and slasher movies and things like that. I think getting into the gore part of it is an easy way of educating people on what paths never to go down again.
When you study dictators in and out, and there was a Netflix show about this, it was called How to Become a Dictator or something,
Acha?
where they're basically doing a playbook on everything that the world's most brutal dictators did over the last 100 years, and how, if you wish to become a dictator, you could use that same playbook.
Right.
But in saying that, honestly, when you study history from this lens, you also understand how to become better at business as long as your heart is in the right place.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be dictatorial, but you can definitely pick up on some anecdotes from dictators' lives.
Yeah.
I think that studying history from this lens can help you through the course of your professional career as well.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it's very crucial to know about the darkness of the human world. To put it in a slightly crass manner, there's a lot of fucked up shit that's happened in the last 100 years.
But there's also other ways of looking at it. Some fucked up shit can actually lead to good things. A dictator isn't necessarily a psycho,
Hmm.
and psychos don't necessarily yield good results, though some can. Simple example: Lee Kuan Yew. What do you think of him? He was a horrible dictator. You know that, right? Like Singapore. People don't remember in the 1960s when Singapore was kicked out of the Malaysian Confederacy, the Malay Confederacy. Uh, a lot of people went missing in Singapore. They used to be jailed, they used to be tortured, they used to be killed off, mostly
This
communists.
is the first time I'm hearing a negative take on Lee Kuan Yew.
But it's a very positive take
Okay.
because he knew where to localize violence, but he built it into a brilliant creative society that today has what, 3 times the per capita income of Japan. And it was a dirt poor country when he started off, but he built it up. So there are lots of good things that can come out. It's very important to recognize that history isn't black and white, it's all shades of gray. There are horrible, horrible things. What the Japanese army, for example, did in Korea, China, Singapore, and other places. It was far worse than anything the British did. But the first thing the Japanese used to do was, create a world class education system wherever they went. It's all in Japanese. They want to integrate you and turn you into, low caste Japanese, I guess, not high up in the caste ladder, not really Japanese, but they used to give you top class education. Is it any surprise then that all the truly great tiger economies of Asia, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, were all completely and thoroughly Japanized by the Japanese, very, very brutally, but it led to something good, right? So it's just one of those things. I mean, how do you, this good guy, bad guy, evil guy, this thing, and then there are dictators who you find almost nothing redeeming about them. Idi Amin, for example, or my favorite dictators, Papa and Baby Doc in Haiti. They're fun guys, right? Like,
Would you say that these are the most brutal dictators of the last 100 years?
I always hesitate to say brutal. I think in terms of sheer brutality, nothing is worse than Mao Zedong and Stalin. But in terms of the most useless dictators who never achieved anything, yeah, it would be some of the African dictators. Some, not all.
Firstly, I have so many tangents I can take you on, because what you said about the tiger economies in Asia, this was under Hirohito, if I'm not.
Well, it was, yeah, under Emperor Hirohito. But remember, we say Emperor Hirohito because in those days, Japan no prime minister lasted for more than a year. They'd keep getting killed or something like that. There was that entire 20-year period in the run up to World War II where prime ministers were Japanese prime ministers were assassinated like you swat mosquitoes or flies, right?
Why do we not hear so much about Mussolini and Hirohito other than them being allies of Hitler? Like, I've not studied about these two in school as much as I've studied about Hitler in school.
Yeah, because that's a very Eurocentric syllabus that we study in school, right? Japan and the Asian theater was a sideshow. Italy was essentially a sidekick to Germany. Remember, Germany united before Italy. It industrialized much before Italy. Italy didn't start industrializing till Mussolini came in the 1920s. Germany had already industrialized by the 1870s, when Bismarck was busy with his policy of blood and iron and all of that. So Germany had a head start. Mussolini was the sidekick. You can also argue Mussolini was nowhere near as bad as Hitler was. In fact, Mussolini and his foreign minister, Count Giano, they used to consider Hitler a bit of a drug addled whack job. They just went along with it because it was, well, big brother, more powerful, more sexy, better uniforms. Hugo Boss designed uniforms. In those days, Italian design wasn't as great as German Porsche and Hugo Boss and things like that. So yeah, so there was this in Europe, as Eurocentric histories go, Mussolini was a sidekick and Japan was just a sideshow.
But under Japanese imperialism, a lot of Asia suffered.
A lot of Asia suffered, including Indians. One of the things we never talk about is how nasty the Japanese were to Indian prisoners of war and the Indian population in Singapore. We don't want to talk about it.
Can I just pause you here for a bit? I know I'm pausing you a little too much, but I'm pausing you from the perspective of drawing out images of dictators and dictatorships in the minds of the listeners. So let's pick up a single dictator one at a time, each person that you've named, and then kind of give out their story.
Okay.
Because there is a common thread.
Yes.
So firstly, I'd like to ask you about that common thread in terms of what is even a dictator and where does this come from, perhaps even from a historical perspective. Where does this concept come from? Over to you. Then we can head into Hirohito.
Okay, so a dictator is a very modern concept, right? Even though the term dictator is there from the Roman, it's a Latin term, but it's only come about ever since democracy became the norm, which is really late 1900s and early 2000s. And even there's this thing that before that you had kings, you had absolute rulers and monarchs who were all dictators in that sense, right? It's only when democracy becomes the norm that you get somebody who suspends democracy for a period of time, who's not a king, does not claim divine rulership or whatever, takes over the government, doesn't allow democratic functioning, and becomes an absolute ruler in their own right. And that is why dictators are such a modern phenomenon. It's something that goes with democracy, right? So that's basically what a dictator is. Now, you can have dictators who are not good in their lifetime who become good in the longer term. There are dictators who are good in their own lifetimes. There are dictators who are truly such a mixed bag that you don't even know where to classify them, and then they're just downright god-awful dictators, right? It's such a tough basket to put anybody into, especially now, for a country like India with a philosophical system like the Vedas and things like that, which is all about shades of gray. We love this sort of black and white interpretation. Ye acha, this guy was good, this guy was bad. It's tough. Like, even Stalin, I can find redeeming features in. You'll ask me what's a redeeming feature in Hitler? Fashion. A Porsche. Fanta. Do you like Fanta? See, you have Hitler to thank for Fanta. Hugo Boss. The Volkswagen, the Beetle.
BMW.
BMW, yeah, that too. And so, there's lots of these. It's like yin and yang. The thing about yin and yang is there's a black dot in the white and a white dot in the black because the origin of one lies in the other. It's kind of like that, which is not what you want to hear, but that's usually historians don't operate on black and whites. It's all shades of gray.
I think let's at this point we should pick up names
Hmm.
and try breaking it down in terms of uh, what constituted their rise as well as what the long term effects were.
Yeah.
Again, from the perspective of the modern day,
Hmm.
in terms of the phase that we live in human society, do you think there's a chance we'll get to see dictatorships again?
You're seeing dictatorships being formed as we speak. They are not dictatorships have moved on, like we discussed. A dictator as we know it is such a late 1800s and 1900s phenomenon. The nature of dictatorship also moves. So I would literally say that the Obama years and the Biden years were a dictatorship of ideas in a sense. You know, politically correct talk, uh, mass indoctrination and dogmatization, to the point where free speech have become crimes in Germany and Britain, especially. Britain, of all people, which is considered the mother of free speech and parliamentary tradition and things like that. It's gone down a very, very dark path. And there's this saying that the best of intentions lead the path to hell is paved with good intentions. That's exactly what you see. So a lot of this race baiting today, I mean, it started under Obama, right? Which is what? A white man is fundamentally, a white hetero man is fundamentally evil. He's responsible for all the evil on earth. And every other person of color, especially if you're not a hetero, is a victim. This gets institutionalized. People are made to feel bad about their ethnicity, about their culture, and whatever. And you're actively suppressed and made to feel like shit. It's psychological gaslighting. And then it comes up with you can't restrict people's constitutional freedoms in America. So what you introduce is cancel culture, where the constitution doesn't throw you in jail, but you destroy people financially, economically, and whatever through this. That is the beginning of that. That's in fact how Hitler became popular. You know, in Weimar Germany, which is after the World War One and till World War Two, um, Hitler and the Nazi Party's ideas were very extreme. People don't realize the amount of lawfare that was used on them and the number of Nazi leaders that were thrown in jail, which went on making them more and more and more and more popular till he wins the 1934 election. Right. And after he wins the election, well, he cancels elections. Right. Uh, but why did it lead up to there? You see that happening even today. People in Europe are labeled far right, right wing, we won't touch you, untouchability essentially. What's happened with AFD, Alternative for Deutschland? Uh, Crazy left wing loonies are okay, but imagine this woman is Alice Weedle, who heads the AFD. She's a lesbian. She has a Sri Lankan partner. Now, all of this would have landed her up in a concentration camp in Germany, being a homosexual, violating the race laws. Uh, but she's a fascist, really? How?
That's all I've heard about the AFD.
Yeah.
If I talk to any of my friends who've lived in Europe over the last 5-10 years, they talk about the AFD as the second coming of the Nazi party.
Yeah.
But what's the truth?
It's the exact opposite, because you look at the areas where the AFD gets its largest vote shares. They are all traditionally the areas that did not support Hitler in 1934. Right? She is anti-immigrant, anti-illegal immigration. She is fiscally conservative, as much as you can be in Germany. She's not fiscally. She's not American Trump style fiscal conservative. But the center in Germany has moved so far left that they'll say this is right-wing Nazi. But remember, Nazi is what? National Socialist. The Nazis were socialists, bro. they weren't right wing at all. They were one, in fact, Germany versus Russia was communists versus socialists.
Hmm.
There was no right wing involved in this. Mussolini was proudly a socialist, right? Um, this whole idea that dictatorships and right wing dictatorships are a threat is a very, very modern left wing way of pushing you a certain way. And remember, left wing dictatorships, Stalin and Mao Zedong. Do you know Stalin killed more Russians than the German army ever did? Mao Zedong killed 7 times the number of his fellow Chinese than the Japanese Imperial Army ever did. Right? But why are Hitler and General Tojo the epitome of evil and not Stalin and Mao Zedong? Hmm? Uh, this is the sort of gaslighting and bad academia which the left is actually very good at. And they gaslight you into believing certain things. Never believe that. One of the first things that Hitler did was he almost nationalized. I mean, it wasn't nationalized per se, but most of Germany's industry was capitalism did not work. It was all, made subjective to German war needs and the Nazi party's national vision. And everybody had to serve that. They were given quotas. They were told what to do. It was not a free market in operation. Was it racial? Yes. Russia was no less racial, by the way. Stalin hated Jews. Um, there were whole ethnicities that were wiped out under Stalin. There were people who were treated shockingly. The entire Chechen nation was uprooted from the Caucasus and shifted out to Kazakhstan or someplace like that. And it was some 15, 20 years before they were even allowed back into the Caucasus, right? Uh, Same thing that Mao Zedong did. Whole communities wiped out. So, we tend to get attracted to this sort of leftist nomenclature because life is messy. And the left brings this sort of scientific methodology. They want you to pretend that, there is this scientific way of explaining everything and anything, which humans seek order in everything. So once you can explain it off as an ordered structure, you get very attracted to it. You invent all the language around it. It becomes the basis of all the way you think. They're very good at that. There have been actual right-wing dictators, and there have been, for example, Franco in Spain. So let's talk about Franco, because Franco is a very unusual kind of guy, especially when you contrast him with Portugal. So I'm going to contrast Spain and Portugal. Franco, not a look, no dictator's a nice guy, right? Okay, horrible fellow. Under him, Spain is one of the poorest countries in Europe. But because of him, he's horrible. In the Spanish Civil War, he massacres, kills people, women, children, everything, uses gas. There's that famous painting Guernica of Pablo Picasso, which is all about the gassing of this town, well, the bombing of this town called Guernica. At the end of it, Spain ends up becoming the 10th biggest economy on earth. And all of this coming from a guy called Franco, who is barely literate. I mean, I won't say he's illiterate, but let's say he's not very well educated. And, well, horrible guy ends up with good results, keeps his country out of war, keeps his country out of World War II. So Spain is spared the horrors of that war. Portugal, on the other hand, has this guy called Salazar, who's a professor of economics at Coimbra. He destroys Portugal. Forget economics, the bugger can't fix anything in Portugal. And he's actually anti-racist. You know that? That's the most amazing thing. He brings in this policy called miscegenation, where all Portuguese colonies, including brown-skinned Indian Goans, are meant to marry white people and things like that. So very inclusive, non-racist at a time where everybody else was racist. He tries building that society. It fails spectacularly. And Portugal remains poor for a very, very long time, till the EU and things like that. These things are impossible to pin down. There's, like I said, it's shades of grey.
Didn't Franco create Real Madrid?
I think he did. I,
He
I
was a
don't know
very big
sports much,
Real
but
Madrid fan. I think he had a very big role to play in Real Madrid's early success.
it was a, what I do know is he used sports majorly for propaganda. And this was when the Soviet Union was being rehabilitated on the international stage. He hated the USSR. But when the USSR first started playing matches outside of the USSR, it was a huge thing. They brought a system of football which the world hadn't seen, but he ensured, I think, through a little bit of terror, to ensure that the Spanish team beat them. And he used that as a sort of propaganda tool. Because the USSR had been helping the other side in the Spanish Civil War. So for him, it was particularly important. But I don't know the history of how much he actually supported Real Madrid.
Okay. Let's head straight into the body of the podcast now. Should we begin with Idi Amin? Good point to begin?
Good point to begin.
Okay. You'll have to give some context on Idi Amin and everything that he's known for. And you also said that his reign didn't lead to much for Uganda.
It actually led to complete disaster for Uganda, because you take your most productive population, which is the Indians out there. And why were Indians so important in Africa? Because the profit margins were razor thin. Most capitalists would not go there. It was your average Patel and Shah from Gujarat who would go there, operate in those razor thin margins, and bring development in that area. And he, of course, did not like Indians because he felt they controlled the economy. He didn't realize how crucial their role was for Uganda. One fine day, he decides to tell them all to get out. They have to leave in 6 months. They can't take any of their property with them. All of it has to be left behind. You can at best take very little with you. Which was still, what he did to the Indians was still better than what he did to his own countrymen, which was killing huge numbers of them, usually in extremely sadistic, brutal ways. And he destroyed Uganda, which is why his government didn't survive. Right? It collapsed quite rapidly because, let's put it this way, he wasn't a good dictator in that he didn't even know how to maintain power properly. Bit like Pol Pot. When you go over a certain limit, you need to have state power to maintain control. And the reason modern dictators, that's to say late 19th and 20th century dictators, seem so much worse, is because industrialization and modern stuff like telephones, telegram, railways, they allow a state to maintain much more pervasive, in-your-face control over a society. So you have a dictator who was probably much crazier than Stalin. I wouldn't consider Stalin crazy, but anyway. But with none of the capacity of Stalin. Stalin realized in order to be that level of crazy, you had to build railways, you had to build industry, you had to build a secret police, you had to build telephone, telegram, all of that. Idi Amin didn't. So just like Pol Pot, who literally deindustrialized Cambodia, killing off, almost a third of his own population, they just withered away. The neighboring armies invaded, and that was it. Poof.
Have you watched this film called The Last King of Scotland?
Oh, yeah.
It's
very tame.
What do you mean?
It doesn't really show how much of a whack job the man was.
If someone's not seen The Last King of Scotland, that's the film I'd point them towards to really kind of immerse themselves into the subject of dictators. While I was growing up, I heard this legend about Idi Amin that he used to consume human meat. I don't know whether that's an urban legend or...
No, he actually did.
Okay.
He actually consumed human meat of his enemies, but this is a very common thing in equatorial Africa. You will still have, albinos are still considered witches in Africa, and your life expectancy if you're an albino is next to nothing. You will be caught, you will be killed, you will be hacked up, and you will be eaten. It's the same for pygmies in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Even today?
Even today, they're caught, they're killed, and they're eaten. Oh yeah, they're eaten. So this is actually very common. You have a whole load of African dictators, modern dictators, who have done this. There was this guy called Bokassa in Burkina Faso, I think, yeah, or was it Chad or Mali, one of those. Um, the guy was so mad, he crowned himself the next Napoleon. He actually had the French make him a throne the way Napoleon's throne was made. So you have the last king of Scotland in Idi Amin. Bokassa thought of himself as the second avatar of Napoleon. He literally wore the same clothes that Napoleon wore for his coronation. He even had his crown made the way Napoleon's crown was made and declared himself emperor. Right. So you get this stuff, right? It's really kooky stuff. And in that sense, I get Mussolini, Hitler, Mao, and Stalin are better because they went identifiably mad. These guys, you can argue, are identifiably mad.
How does a madman like that rise to the top? Because it honestly takes at least 2 decades to be in a position to even become a dictator.
Yes, but you can rise to the top because you're willing to break taboos that other people aren't. You know, your psychopathy is so great. You're willing to do things other people are not. You essentially out brutalize everybody else, right? That's exactly how people like Bokassa or uh, Idi Amin come about.
So very, very brutal in their origin years.
Yeah.
Very often a product of a military background.
A military or an imagined military background.
What does that mean?
They have great delusions of being Julius Caesar or Alexander or Napoleon, the great generals. They're not, but in a localized environment, they feel that because they keep winning victories, they are the next Alexander or Napoleon. You've also had dictators who didn't have a military background. So, for example, Mao Zedong or Stalin, they barely ever fought. Hitler at least fought as a colonel in World War One. Mussolini never did. He was a journalist. He was a very smart journalist, by the way. You know, he used to speak 5, 6 different languages. He used to speak fluent English, by the way. But Stalin or Mao never fought. And yet he used to call himself Marshal Stalin. Right? They did not have military backgrounds necessarily, but military attire, this wanting you to believe that they are Grand Marshal or Field Marshal or Grand Admiral or, I don't know, Air Chief Marshal. No dictator's ever been in it. Actually, you know, Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, was the only dictator I know who was from the Air Force. Other than that, there have always been ground generals who have become, for whatever reason, I don't know. But not necessarily military backgrounds. And in fact, Stalin is the counterpoint to this. You know, his entire strategy was to not be precocious. He used to take all the jobs that other people didn't want. So under Lenin, there were two people who, I'm simplifying history a bit. There were two people who were the rising stars. One was Leon Trotsky, the other was Stalin. Trotsky was all, you know, flamboyance. He wanted all the sexy jobs. You know, defense is sexy, gimme defense. Finance is sexy, gimme finance. Stalin was like, okay, nobody wants public sanitation. Who wants public toilets? Nobody wants education. Fine, I'll take education. He accumulated power by getting all the useless, what were considered non-sexy, useless ministries. And that is how he accumulated power. So, you know, this term we have called Chupa Rustam. He was the Chupa Rustam. So he was the exact diametric opposite of people like, say, Idi Amin.
Quietly building up his power over the years.
Yeah. Institutional bureaucratic dictatorship. You accumulate bureaucratic powers that nobody wants, and then you're too powerful before anybody realizes it.
Let's take up the story of Stalin. Beginning with Lenin, beginning with this Russian Tsar system. So, World War I kind of breaks out when the Tsar of Russia, along with his family, is brutally murdered.
Yeah.
That also begins the Russian Revolution. Sort of the face of the Russian Revolution, the main leader is Lenin. And he is all about what philosophy?
Look, technically. So Lenin described communism as Marxism plus electricity.
What is Marxism?
Marxism is this idea that this gentleman called Marx comes up with, which is, there are four elements of production, right? Capital, entrepreneurship, labor, and land. He says all the rest are unimportant. The only real value addition here is labor, and therefore labor must have collective power. That's the basics of it. Now, he also believes that when this happens, humanity will reach this utopia. And they believe that everything has a scientific explanation, when in fact, things don't have a scientific. Humanity is very tough to predict, right? Now, to this, Lenin adds energy and industry and all of that. Now, remember, Lenin is one of the biggest traitors to Russia around, because when his country was fighting the Germans put him in a train car and sent him over to Russia to weaken Russia and destroy it. And the moment he gains power, Russia, the Allies were just 6 months away from victory. But because he wanted power to himself, he signs a horrible peace treaty with Germany called the Brest-Litovsk Pact, which gives Germany everything it wanted. Germany would have collapsed in 6 to 8 months. Everybody knew it was going to collapse in 6 to 8 months because the shortages had set in, the reverses had set in. But no, he wanted power now because he realized till he got power right now, he couldn't eliminate all the other factions. So Lenin was in fact the true father of Stalin in that sense, ideological father, because he was brutal. He didn't care what he did to his own country and countrymen as long as power, 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 power. Power hungry beyond belief. Now, he holds an election in which his party gets 17 or 20% of the vote. He didn't even get the largest share. I think it was the Mensheviks who got another faction which got the largest. He then declares the entire election irrelevant and he cancels the election. So they actually had an election after the Tsar was overthrown. The results were negated. It was declared irrelevant, and Bolshevik party rule, Communist party rule, was institutionalized. So he and all the massacres that Stalin is famous for, it was actually Lenin that started these massacres, horrible massacres. The Tsar's family was killed on Lenin's orders. Completely extrajudicial execution. I mean, it's a different thing if the Tsar deserved it or not. The Tsar was a horrible, horrible fellow, right? I mean,
Why?
incompetent, but believed in his great competency, felt he was guided by God to rule over Russia. So it didn't matter how many people died, he was always right and everybody else was always wrong.
Okay, got it.
And, had Lenin not come and been such a crazy whack job, and Stalin was an even crazier whack job, we're talking about relatively. Compared to these other two, the Tsar wasn't so bad. And that is why you think of him as a good Tsar right now. Right? He was a nasty fellow. At his coronation, his uncle didn't arrange the coronation properly, so some 5 to 15,000 people, depending on the account, died in stampedes and things, which is why he was always known as the Bloody Tsar. He never punished his own uncle for bungling that entire issue. And he was always known as he was considered a bad omen. It was bound to happen at that point. Terrible fellow. But then people didn't realize how much worse Lenin and Stalin were. But the way this whole leftist sort of whitewashing factory works is they'll tell you Tsar was very, very bad, which is true. He was very, very bad. But Lenin and Stalin were a lot worse. The redeeming feature, at least of Stalin, was that he industrialized Russia. Forcibly, horrible, huge cost. But that's something the Tsar could never do.
What's the story of Russia post World War One, and why is Stalin this face of evil as he's projected in mainstream media now?
So World War One, the Tsar loses control because he's so fantastically incompetent. He refuses to trust people. His wife trusts a guy. First, he trusts his wife, who's equally incompetent. The wife trusts a guy called Rasputin, who basically controls her because he's able to control the crown prince's hemophilia. And what ends up happening is the Russian front just keeps collapsing, 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 collapsing. Uh, they come up with some ideas, badly executed, the Brusilov offensive and things like that, fails, just keeps collapsing. Uh, Civil order breaks down in Russia. They can tolerate no more. And the Tsar isn't brutal enough. You remember how we discussed Idi Amin didn't have the ability to control his people because he wasn't industrial? Same thing, Tsar can't control his people. Revolution breaks out. He's replaced. The Tsar abdicates. He abdicates for himself and his son. So he ends the Romanov dynasty himself. And first, the Mensheviks take over. Now, they try to be quite democratic. They want to fight the war, see it through to its end. But then the Bolsheviks, who are the Lenin faction, take over. There's a nasty civil war that kills millions of people. Both sides are very, very nasty in this. The Tsarist side is also extremely nasty. There was this genuine freak show called Baron Ungarn Sternberg, Ungarn something, I forget. Quasi-Hindu Buddhist Russian imperialist who wants to create a Mongol Khanate. So he operates in the parts of Russia adjacent to Mongolia, and he wants to revive the sort of Russian monarchy in the image of Genghis Khan. Does a lot of shit that Genghis Khan does as well, but ultimately loses because people don't want to talk about this. The communists were much more brutal. They were willing to do things that even the worst royalist generals were not willing to do. Ultimately, they win by the mid-20s. Lenin dies. Lenin didn't die aise-vaise. He was actually shot in the head. There was a bullet lodged in his head, which in his last months made him madder and madder and madder. This is actually demonstrated because they couldn't get the bullet out. The poisoning started in the head. He becomes progressively much more erratic in his last few months, and finally he dies because of the bullet, ultimately, proximate cause. And Stalin by this time has accumulated all the bureaucratic power, and he takes it to the next level. And his way of controlling the party, because communist parties are very hierarchical. There are people with their own roles and things. The moment you show any level of promise of popularity, you're accused of being a spy and killed off. So there was nothing in 400 years of Romanov history, or 300 years of Romanov history, that was even remotely as bad as Lenin and Stalin combined. Right? Horrible characters. Whole community is wiped out, dude. But, you don't really talk about it. And what ends up happening is he terrorizes everybody so much, you don't know for what you're going to end up in Siberia or shot. There are personal signed lists of his for at least 1 million people killed, executed.
Why Siberia?
Because it's a horrible place to be. If you go to certain parts of Siberia, there's the area called Yakutia, which acts as a funnel for Arctic winds. And it's actually colder there than it is in the Arctic at any given point of time.
Wow.
The coldest place on Earth is a place called Oymyakon, which is there. It's on average minus 60 degrees Celsius.
Wow.
Yeah. And imagine working and living out there. It's literally hell freezes over. It's hell freezes over. And he's forcing you to work in these conditions, no respect for human life. Millions of people just dying from overwork, being underfed, undernourished, underclothed, through exposure, whatever. He doesn't give a damn about human lives. Remember, Russia lost its will to fight in the First World War for far, far 1/10 the number of deaths that it endured in the Second World War. But in the Second World War, Stalin's stupidity plus brutality leads to 26 million deaths. 26 million, but the people are more scared of Stalin than they are of Hitler.
Yeah, there's a movie called Last Sniper or something.
Yeah. Jude Law, right?
Yeah.
In Stalingrad.
Yeah, but basically they've kind of tried explaining how the Russian war tactic during World War II was to just throw maximal soldiers into the war.
Yes.
So the moment the first bunch of soldiers die, they actually pick up civilians and throw them into the war. Give them weapons.
You know, initially, the Soviet army had one rifle per two people. So if Ranveer and Abhijit are the team, I will rush ahead with my rifle. You don't have a rifle. You're hiding behind me. I get shot, then you pick up my rifle and charge. They also had penal brigades, which is people from jails were taken out, and wherever there was a minefield, they'll be made to charge first so that they all die, and then the troops go in. They were horrible. I mean, imagine. But now let me spin this the positive way. This is why I say there's no black and white. For somebody as murderous as Hitler, a weakling like the Tsar would have collapsed like that. The reason Russia won was precisely because it had somebody brutal like Stalin, who first brutalized society and forcibly industrialized it, and then was absolutely unflinching in the number of people he was willing to sacrifice to win. Russia would not, the USSR would not have won that war had it not been for Stalin. Let's be very, very clear about this, right? Ultimately, the hero is the average Soviet citizen, the average Ukrainian, the average Belarusian, the average Russian, the average Kazakh, in fact, or Uzbek or Turkmen or whatever. But it needs a leader. So you tell me on balance, did Stalin destroy Russia or did he make Russia? It's a very difficult question to answer. Had Hitler taken over because he considered the Slavs to be subhuman, he would have killed all of them. In fact, his instructions to his army was to kill as many. He had more respect for French lives, Austrian lives, of course, because they're Germans, than he did for Russians. For him, Russians were subhuman to all be killed. They would have been killed irrespective had it not been for Stalin. So again, shades of grey. How do you describe Stalin then?
Can you name 5 or 6 of your favorite war films that actually represent history in an accurate manner?
See, there's no war film that actually represents history, right? None of them are terribly accurate, but I still enjoy them. So I would say Guns of Navarone.
Why? Give a why behind each.
Because of the characters, and it's such a thrilling premise that you're going up this hill in Greece to get these two radar-guided giant guns, which is actually based on truth, because the Germans focused on these large super guns, as they were called, which could really fire up to long. They were militarily useless. They actually cost Germany the war. These technological marvels, which were militarily useless. The Eagle has landed again because the plot was so funky and the characters were so nice. There's a Japanese war movie called Tora Tora Tora, which is about the attack on Pearl Harbor, which is so much better than that Ben Affleck movie, Pearl Harbor. The next one would be this, it's a Japanese-Mongolian joint production, I think, called Mongol. It's about the initial part of Genghis Khan's.
Really?
Yeah. 2007 movie, I think. Brilliant movie. I mean, the sets and costumes, the tactics are all wrong. Forget about that. That and the fifth war movie. Oh, does it have to be World War II or no? No. I love a lot of the sword and sandals, the Roman era movies. So I'd say, who's this German actor who comes in Inglourious Bastards?
Fassbender.
Michael Fassbender, who goes to past Hadrian's Wall from Britain to Scotland and has the entire Roman legion wiped out. It's an exciting movie, but yeah.
If I were to add to this list, have you watched this film called The Great Escape?
Yeah.
It's an old film about concentration camps. That was my first introduction to World War II. Kind of set the tone. That's how a lot of people look at World War II, through the lens of concentration camps.
Yes.
There's actually a film called American Sniper with Bradley Cooper. He's from Hangover. So it's about a sniper during the Iraq War and how his PTSD leads to him having a duality of his own mind.
That brings me to something. The best war on film ever made series is called Over There. It's about the American occupation of Iraq following the 2003 invasion. I think that's a must watch. I think it's the closest you get to reality of any war occupation movie ever.
Mm. Uh, Coming back to the subject of dictators, I think we were talking about Stalin.
Stalin, yeah.
Uh, can you draw out his life post World War II?
So he didn't live for very long after World War II, right? Like World War II ends in what, 45? And by 52, he's dead.
Hmm.
Um, and his bloodlust never let up because he realized the only way of controlling was through sheer terror. And for him, the more industrialized and technology you had, the better his ability to control. So it was always finding enemies where none existed, where you didn't know what you had to do to be declared an enemy. You could be the most loyal fan of Stalin, but one fine day you'd be accused of treason and you'd get carted off.
Why?
Because at that point, no, everybody's shit scared. They're too scared to think of any plot to replace him, and you just can't replace him.
Have you been to Russia?
Yeah, several times.
How do they look back at Stalin?
Right now, a very mixed take. And the Russians are much more nuanced than a lot of other people. They're such a morose race. They take a great deal of pleasure in suffering. I've never seen. I mean, have you read Turgenev and Dostoevsky and all of that? It's so
Melancholic?
bleak and death and dying and misery. I don't think I've come across a country more dedicated to mental BDSM than the Russians.
Mental BDSM.
Yeah, it's like
Like talking about all this self-suffering, suffering within
yeah.
history. God.
It's like they love suffering,
Hmm.
right? I don't know why. It's in their national character, I guess. But for them, Stalin is such a mixed character because of that. They recognize that some good came of it. I mean, there's not a single Russian who will tell you they could have won the war without Stalin being in charge of it.
Hmm.
At the same time, they also recognize he was an absolutely horrible human being who caused a lot of long-term harm to Russia. There wasn't a single member, there isn't a single Russian family who didn't lose a family member during Stalin's purges. Not one. Not one family. Maybe somewhere, some yak herders in extreme Siberia who were untouched. But other than that, nobody.
Have you been to Siberia?
Yeah.
What's the vibe?
Bleak, freezing. I've not been to Oymyakon yet, but I've been to the southern tip of that Yakut gap. It's called Yakutsk. And it goes down. When I was there, it was something like minus 37 or something.
Wow.
Yeah.
What does minus 37 feel like?
So, it's very strange. If once you're well wrapped up, the minuses don't matter anymore. It's only the part of you that's exposed, the eyes and the face that feel the cold. And there you have to wear goggles because, the moisture in your eyes will freeze and you'll get frostbite in your eyes. And you wear a mask much before COVID and all that started because your breath warms up the rest of your face. And how there were herders out there, the original Yakut people who have been nomadic cattle herders for the longest time. You never understand how people manage to live in that, but they do. But yeah, it's exciting. I've never been to Oymyakon. I want to go to Oymyakon.
But is the energy of the land sad?
It's unforgiving.
Brutal.
It's brutal. And I think that adds a lot to the Russian character. That, you have no natural defenses other than the cold. And so you've got to be extremely brutal to survive out there.
You know, Bane's dialogue from Batman, I was born in the dark.
Like that.
That's how I look at
Basically.
Russians.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They're born in such a brutal land.
But it also leads to great beauty. You know,
Mm.
a Russian can outdrink you. He or she can have a lot more fun than you can. Uh, they have a great tradition of music and literature, uh, great architecture. Um, but for all that greatness, there's also a very deep, dark side to it.
In almost all the people's minds.
Not necessarily. Like, there's these soft urban Russians now since the 60s when life wasn't so brutal anymore and the Stalinist repression had ended. Uh, but you do get hints of it. Yeah,
I mean, I'm pretty sure Putin has studied all these people in and out.
I'm sure he has.
But do you think that's the case with every world leader? Do you think even Modi's cabinet, Trump's cabinet, everyone is constantly studying recent world history? No.
Yeah.
But won't there be lessons to be learned?
There should be lessons to be learned, but I don't think Modi's cabinet studies anything outside of India, realistically, except in terms of finance or whatever. Um, and in terms of the Trump cabinet, I think they have a very good hold on history, even though they are mocked and laughed at. I think they've picked out the distilled essence of history much better. There's this academic derision of people who are not validated by academia. What do you actually know? I know so much more than you because I've written 20 academic papers, peer reviewed journal papers. And this is the classic, it's the emperor has no clothes.
Hmm.
It took the little stupid little boy to call out the emperor's stupidity when all the scholars in court were pretending that the emperor had clothes.
Hmm.
Sometimes you don't need that much. And this is again that Salazar versus the failed economics professor versus the semi-literate general who did economics much better than the economics professor.
Hmm.
Right? It's like
Hmm.
that.
Perhaps what you truly need in order to stay in power for a very long time is brutality along with street smarts.
There's no one way. And see, this is the thing. This is how the left captures you. They want you to think that there is a template. There is one way of doing things. There is none. There's 100 different ways you can become a dictator. There's 100 different things you can do once you become a dictator. So Lee Kuan Yew was horrible in the initial stages, but after that, he used violence very sparingly. Once he consolidated power, he did not have you killed. He used to bankrupt you. So the Singapore parliament is the only parliament where you can be sued for what you say in parliament. And because of that, he would go after his enemies and he would bankrupt them financially. They'd have nothing else to do. I think that's a fairly civilized way to go about it, right?
How
So-
do you bankrupt someone?
You sue them for defamation.
Okay. I remember when we were speaking about doing this episode outside, I briefly asked you about your life in Iraq.
Life to nahi tha, it was a month or so, 2 months in Iraq. Yeah.
You spent 2 months in Iraq in which year?
This was 84 or 85, I forget the exact year, on a holiday.
Peak of Saddam's rule?
Yeah, peak of Saddam's rule. It was also the peak of the Iran-Iraq war, by the way. There used to be missiles falling and things like that. But I have a very pleasant memory of Baghdad in those days, right? It was very modern. The way you see modernism, which is women going around in skirts, sleeveless tops and things like that, women in positions of power. I remember I used to keep going to the museum, the Baghdad Museum, which then got ransacked when the Americans botched up their invasion. And, they loved the fact that a little kid wanted to come and read things about Babylonian history and Sumerian history and all of that. So, all my history teachers always loved me, right? I've never met a historian, a museum person, or an archaeologist that didn't love me simply because I'm constantly like, oh, tell me about this. They're not used to getting much of that. But I remember it being a lovely place. But when you're a kid, you're protected from all the
Dirt.
dirt. And much later, when my aunt was showing me these albums after my uncle was posted there. Um, After he had died, she was showing me these albums. She was showing me all these people who were in photos with me in some of them, not all, in some of them, where she's like, oh, these people, the police came at night, took them and shot them. What the hell? But apparently I have no memory of these people, but
So would you say that it was a flourishing society with a strong element of brutality thanks to Saddam's mind?
yes.
That's what it was. So he had kept the country uh, as its best flourishing self, but yet
Again, see, it's such a difficult country because it's an artificially created country by the British. It's not a natural country because there are Kurds in the north, there's Sunnis in the middle, and there's a huge Shia majority in the south, right? He was a Sunni who hated the Shia. And in order to hold such a diverse society together, he believed he had to be very brutal. Maybe, may not be. I think he was excessively brutal with the benefit of hindsight. Not that I saw it when I was a kid. Um, and in the end, it was excessive brutality that led to the collapse of his system. Megalomania, too much warmongering and invading all your neighbors.
can you draw out the whole timeline? Starting from when Iraq was ruled by the British.
Okay, so it was actually Iraq is very curious. Uh, Iraq is the Arab word for Iran. So it was called Iraq Arab and Iraq Ajam. Uh, Iraq Arabic Persia and infidel. Ajam isn't exactly kafir, but it's very close to kafir.
Really?
And what ends up happening is what is today Shia Iran stays under the Safavids. It's called the Battle of Chaldiran, which is the Ottomans versus the Safid dynasty. And the boundary gets drawn at what is today Iran, Iraq. Now, Iraq is Arab, it remains Sunni. The Safavids conquer Persia and they turn it Shia. And when the Ottoman Empire collapses after the First World War, the British take it over. It's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is also the root cause of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in a sense. It's where Jordan comes out of, Syria comes out of it, Iraq comes out of it, Lebanon comes out of it, Israel kind of comes out of it. Tangentially, Saudi Arabia comes out of it. And if you notice, that is why most of their boundaries are all straight lines, fake boundaries drawn on paper. Now, Iraq is such an artificial identity ki upar there are Kurds, Sunnis, Shias, like we discussed. There is a king imposed by the British who is very unpopular. He's killed off by his own people in a coup. This party called the Baath Party takes over, and there's this whole thing of pan-Arabism. This is the royals versus republics that contest that happened in the entire Arab world in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So, Egypt, the king was overthrown and it became a republic under Nasser. In Iraq, the same thing happened. The king was overthrown, killed very brutally with his entire family. And he was the cousin of the Jordanian king, the current king's dad.
Like this is 70s?
60s, 50s, and 60s.
Okay.
Killed, gets overthrown, and there's these socialist revolutions. So from kingships, they become dictatorships. In Iraq, it's something called the Baath Party. There is a leader who slowly loses power. Again, Saddam Hussein, was the Stalin type. He accumulated all the bureaucratic power that nobody else wanted and became the real power. Initially, he did some good. He started industrializing and things like that. The problem was he overestimated his industrial capacity, got into wars he shouldn't have, like the Iran-Iraq war, ended up destroying his own country because he didn't know when to stop. You're taking on a country like Iran, which is much more powerful than you. And people tend to forget, till 1979 under the Shah, Iran had a higher living standard and higher per capita income than Taiwan and South Korea. Had it continued there, it would have been a first world country by today. European style industrial power. It got aborted because of Khomeini and the Iran Iraq war and things. So he starts all these wars. And the moment he finishes a war with Iran, he starts off a war with Kuwait. And that's the end of him. I mean, good, bad, I don't really know. I would say on balance, bad. Some good things.
Bad due to megalomania.
Yeah,
Wanting more
you
and
don't
more.
know when to say enough.
Which year was this Kuwait Iraq conflict?
1989 he invaded. 1990. 1990 he got kicked out. And sanctions. 10 years worth of sanctions, and then the Americans invade and get rid of him and hang him.
Why did America invade?
Look, there's the conspiracy theory explanation, and then there's the more rational explanation. I don't know where the truth lies in this, but conspiracy theory explanation is Jewish conspiracy, oil, etc., which is it stretches it too far. There is the more sane conspiracy theory one, which is that George Bush Jr. felt that George Bush Sr. lost the election because he did not finish the Iraq war properly. And because the son felt that the 1990 war was not finished off properly, that is why his dad lost the election. And it was his family's unfinished business to get rid of Saddam Hussein.
Wow.
Which is why they concocted a whole load of evidence about Iraqi chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction and things like that. As it's called, WMD, weapons of mass deception, they called it after that. I think that was partially the case, but it fused with the fact that having a guy like Saddam Hussein, he never learnt his lesson. If you'd allowed him to get rehabilitated and build up Iraq again, he would have again started a whole bunch of regional wars. So I think it was the right thing to do, maybe, not for the Iraqis, obviously. I mean, their country's fractured, but then, there's an argument to be made. Was there ever really a country in that place? If it's so prone to fracturing, could it have been a real country? I mean, it was a British invention, really.
I think this whole point of drawing straight borders and grouping together different tribes is effectively a chemical formula to keep war going on for the next 100 years.
It is, right? But then let's look at the counterfactual. If you don't draw these borders, do you think the Sunnis would have stayed in Sunni areas, the Shias would have stayed in Shia areas, and the Kurds would have stayed in Kurd areas? There would have still been conflict. So see, this is why I'm like,
humankind is complex.
And there's no, it's not a fairy tale where, everything's happily ever after. Once you solve one problem, it leads to 100 new sets of problems.
I think humankind enjoys being at war all the time.
Because we're fundamentally psychos. Human beings are probably the worst of all fauna on Earth. There are only 3 other animals, I think, that are known to torture and kill and take pleasure in it. Dolphins, geese, and chimpanzees. And the common ancestor of the chimpanzee and the human is the one that has the psycho gene. Because, there is the Zaire Gap, the Zaire River, which splits chimpanzees to the north and bonobos to the south. Bonobos do not, they do not torture, and they do not kill. Chimpanzees do, and human beings do. And we have a whole bunch of common ancestors that we knew engaged in extremely violent cannibalistic torture behavior. It's the same common gene that makes chimpanzees psycho, that makes human beings psycho. We're the most sinister, and in that sense, we're all Idi Amin. We are the peak species on Earth, the apex predator on Earth, because we we're willing to do things no other species were willing to do. Even insects, even a praying mantis is less cruel per se than the human being is. So, what does it make you feel like when a invertebrate, a reptile, is less violent than you? That's, like I said, we're all Idi Amin,
I'd say it's great fodder for podcasts.
isn't it? Yeah.
Abhijit Iyer-Mitra, thank you. It was fun.
Thank you. I had fun.
Been wanting to do this episode since the first time I ever met you. So I'm glad we did this.
I'm glad we did it too.
And many more history episodes coming your way. So I think the comment section will lead us to the next few chapters.
That's it.
Thank you.
That was the episode for today, ladies and gentlemen. Send in your feedback because there's 3 sequels to this particular episode that are going to be released over the next few weeks. Abhijit Iyer-Mitra, someone I enjoyed just hanging out with and learning from. Send in what you thought about this episode. Comment down below. Send in guest recommendations as well as topic recommendations when it comes to the subject of history because it's one of my personal favorite subjects to cover on TRS. Ranveer and the team will be back very soon, and lots more history content will also be back very, very soon.